I'm your host, Michael Callahan. This is Where We Go Next. And investigative journalism is in trouble. Since 2005, the U.S. has lost about 3,000 newspapers and 43,000 journalists. At the same time, we've also been socially and algorithmically incentivized to gravitate towards shallow, short-form content and away from complex, long-form reporting. But it's exactly that kind of journalism, clear-eyed, on-the-ground, fair investigation, that we need to make sense of what's actually happening, what's actually true. Our guest this week is a 30-year veteran of the news industry, navigating her way through an increasingly fragmented, often fragile media landscape. Nancy Rommelmann is an investigative journalist, columnist, and author. Her work appears in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Reason Magazine, The Free Press, and her Substack. She's also the co-host of the Smoke 'Em If You Got 'Em podcast with Sarah Hepola. Nancy, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Michael.
Well, I'm glad that we're both glad that you're here. Now, before we get to your current journalism beat that has a focus on political news and social unrest, I'd love to trace with you the journey of how you got here as a writer. Because looking back at your early career, at least as much as I'm able to find on the internet in 2024, it doesn't seem like, from an outsider's perspective, to be a very straight line. In 1995, you co-authored a book with Hillary Johnson about MTV's then all-the-rage reality show, The Real World. In 1998, you wrote your second book, Everything You Pretend to Know About Food and Are Afraid Someone Will Ask.
Oh, God.
In 2001 came Rommelmann's Los Angeles Bar and Nightlife Guide.
Okay, I have to go now, Michael.
I must say, Nancy, I really like the last name only thing. Rommelmann feels discerning, authoritative, but I'd love for you to walk us through your journey from ostensibly a pop culture / food beat. Although I do want to, where credit's due, you were writing about John Wayne Gacy as far back as 1994. But I'd love for you to trace the line between the writing you were doing in the 90s and the writing you're doing now. How did you grow and change as a writer over the last 3 decades?
Well, thank you for asking. It's a little bit of a long story. I was reading scripts for a living. I had a baby at home and I was trying to make a living and I was reading scripts for ICM, a big agency. And I fell into my first little article about journalism. It was like a 50-word article for Bikini Magazine. They didn't even pay you, but I loved it. I knew from the minute I wrote my first article, I think I was 30 years old, that's what I wanted to do forever. And in fact, that's what I've done since then. But the Gacy piece, it was a young guy in Hollywood who I knew. He was a musician and an artist, and we'd been at parties together. He was a pen pal of John Wayne Gacy's, the serial killer who was on death row in Illinois. And he wanted to visit Gacy on death row in Illinois before Gacy was executed. This was in 1994. And we had a mutual friend who said, oh, well, Nancy's a journalist. I'd written 2 articles, I think, at that point. So I sent a pitch to a magazine called Details, which is no longer around. And they said, sure, we want 5,000 words on it. My idea was to take a road trip with Rick to go visit Gacy. And they're like, sure, 5,000 words, we'll pay you $5,000. Meanwhile, I've made like $50 as a journalist and didn't know what I was doing. But it turned out I did know what I was doing, I guess instinctually, because we drove across the country. I talked to people in bars and in churches and just got this sense of what it means when we all pay attention to a serial killer and how we sort of create his image so that we can burn it down. So that story didn't wind up going in Details, but it did wind up on the cover of the LA Weekly, which is or was the big alt weekly for many decades in Los Angeles, where I was living at the time. It was a cover story, and it made my career almost overnight. I was able then to write for the Los Angeles Times, and I had a column in the monthly magazine, which was called Buzz Magazine. I was a nightlife columnist there, and I had a little kid to support, so I was just writing all kinds of stuff. I was writing about food. I was writing about bars. I was writing about gardening tools. It didn't matter just to make a living, but you could make a living pretty easily back then in the 90s in LA because people wanted things from Los Angeles.
Yeah, I was just going to say $1 a word sounds as anachronistic today as Blockbuster Video.
Right. And sometimes more than that. If you wrote for Vanity Fair, they were giving you $2 a word and paying for your trip to Paris, which they did for me for a story they never ran and paid in full. So
my God,
that's a good memory.
Yeah.
But in any case, all the books that you mentioned were books for hire because I had to make a living. I had to make money. And The Real World, it was the big show. It was in its fourth season. And they came to the editor-in-chief of the magazine, Buzz Magazine, Alan Mayer, and said, do you have one of your young writers that wants to maybe do this book? It's for hire. And he called a friend of mine who was also a columnist. And she said, well, I don't want to do it alone, but I'll do it with Nancy. We made a total of $15,000 for that book. And it was on the New York Times bestseller list for 14 weeks. We didn't have any royalties. But we had little kids, and then I got 2 more books for hire, which are the ones you mentioned, which was Everything You Pretend to Know About Food, which was hilarious because I was writing this book. There was no internet then, and I'm going to the library and grabbing books and trying to feed a kid and like eating peanut butter while I was writing about caviar. And then the bar guide. And then I have published 4 books since then. Maybe we'll get to those. But I just kept writing. I mean, I was lucky that I was able to make a living as a freelancer. And even though, of course, it's a totally different game now in journalism than it was then or even in the early aughts, I was always able to get columns wherever I was living, whether it was about culture or interviewing people or as a book reviewer. I reviewed for the Oregonian and for the Wall Street Journal. You know, when you have a column, you have some steady money coming in, and then you can go off and do these longer pieces. I think I've written 8 or 10 8,000-word cover stories for the LA Weekly. Los Angeles is a fantastic city to write from, as I'm sure you know. And I just kept going, and I just haven't stopped.
On a recent episode of the podcast that you co-host with fellow guest of this show, Sarah Hepola, Sarah asked, quote, did you know there was a tornado in Dallas yesterday? And you said, quote, if it doesn't happen in New York City or Los Angeles, it's not news, end quote. And it's true that the national news doesn't usually cover local weather, save the truly catastrophic like Hurricane Katrina, if it doesn't happen in New York or LA. But my question to you, and this is going to need a little bit of runway, Nancy, should the national news actually be covering more things on the local level? Because I think some of the turmoil of the last few years, turmoil that you've seen up close and personal on the ground in Portland and elsewhere, is from national outlets covering local events as if they have to do with our national identity or national narrative, when often they don't really have anything to do with anything besides local news. I just want to give one example out of dozens for our listeners, one that took place where you once called home in Portland, Oregon. So I imagine you have heard of it. The incident took place in 2018 and was known as #CrosswalkKathy. As it was originally reported in Newsweek, The Root, Portland Mercury, and elsewhere, a white woman saw a parked car that was blocking the crosswalk, saw that it was blocking people, and called the cops. The car belonged to a couple who were getting takeout food at a restaurant nearby, a black couple. And when they saw the woman, they went over, confronted her, and started filming her, and said on video, quote, this is another white person calling the police on a black person because she said we are illegally parked right here, end quote. And as a result of the reporting by both national and local outlets, Crosswalk Kathy was doxxed and she was sent death threats. And it turns out, of course, however, that she wasn't calling the cops. She called the parking authority, basically the people that put a parking ticket on your windshield. And she didn't know the race of the people who parked the car because honestly, how could she? I mean, absent some race identifying bumper sticker. But over the last 6 or 7 years, it feels like countless distinctly local incidents around incendiary topics like race and sexuality, some true, some false, have been elevated to national news in an attempt to form some kind of national narrative when maybe there isn't one at all. And so I think that's my worry, right? Like about national news covering local news. I think it's healthy that most local news stays local. So I was just really drawn to that kind of back and forth that you and Sarah had, and I just wanted to get your deeper thoughts on it.
Sure. So I was saying that sort of sarcastically because the year before I had been in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where my daughter was working on the TV series Reservation Dogs, and there was a crazy windstorm. We woke up in the morning with thousands upon thousands of downed trees, and I'm talking gigantic trees, and we had lost power for 5 days. I thought it was sort of a big deal. And when I was speaking with friends of mine in New York, and they're like, we haven't heard a thing about it. And I thought, because what had just happened, I think a couple of weeks before, there had been forest fires in Canada, and there had been a lot of smoke in New York City. And wow, the thoughts and prayers from around the world there were a lot of them for New York, and they're dealing with this terrible thing. And I thought, okay, but this happens in Tulsa and it doesn't even get a mention. Of course, I was put right by my daughter's relatives back there. They're like, Nancy, we get this weather all the time. But in terms of what you're talking about, the national news cherry picking incidents, well, it's because what is the narrative of the week? Is it Crosswalk Kathy? Is it She's a Karen? Is it who has the BLM sticker and who doesn't? And who is wearing the mask and who isn't? And we have developed, and I actually hope I haven't developed this sort of appetite because number one, I think it's irresponsible and I think it's not really news to sort of feed some preconceived narrative. Like you're deciding what the story is and then finding the facts to fit that story. That's not journalism, okay? That's some sort of advocacy. And second of all, it's not interesting. Also, I drive around the country all the time and I meet all kinds of people and I think their stories are very valid. And those are the stories that in the quest to fill this narrative that some of the nationals do, they completely ignore what's in front of their face, like what these people are actually doing and actually thinking. So I actually do want the national news to get out of their office and wherever it is in New York or LA and go talk to people without a preset objective of who these people are. I wrote a story recently about some people in Alabama, and I'm telling you, the way that it had been presented.
Oh, yes, we're going to be getting into that.
We'll get to that. Okay. But it's just people are not what you think they are. You put them in boxes because it's convenient for you. That's not how they are. And I am so lucky to be able to know that because I love getting in my car and driving long distances. And I'm lucky that I have people that want me to write about this.
You put it perfectly. I think the key there is the national news doesn't cover events they can't spin into controversy. If there's no angle, and I think these days specifically, if there's no identity angle, it's not covered. And you can't make controversy out of a hurricane or out of a tornado. The thing that frustrates me, and I was especially frustrated about this in like 2020, 2021, I live in Los Angeles. It's a very diverse city. And so my friend group is diverse. We go to a brewery. It looks like the UN. Like there's people from all walks of life just hanging out, playing arcade games, having a beer, chatting. It looks like a utopia of racial harmony. But in these same settings, I'd have friends of mine, I think, spooked by all this national coverage of often isolated local incidents, saying they felt scared about racism and white supremacy. And I'm looking around us in Los Angeles as they're saying this, in the middle of a multiracial setting in which nothing bad is happening. And I'm thinking like, what the national news is doing is wrong. It's like poisoning the minds of people and distorting. I think what you just accurately described is like what actual accurate reality is.
If your objective is to make people fearful, that's a pretty terrible objective. Okay. If your objective is that you should be suspicious of your neighbor, that's really a bad business to be in. And you might want to check yourself. I also think we as people, there are people that maybe being scared makes them feel alive. Maybe being scared makes them feel like they're part of the group that's everybody scared. You know, we saw this during COVID. We've seen this during various protests. People will swim along with a crowd, whether they're true believers, whether they're easily swayed, whether they're afraid they don't want to say anything because they don't want to be perceived as the bad people. So, let's take your friend group at the bar. Okay, dude, do you really think you should be scared? If you're so scared, just go get me a beer. There's nothing scary here. And so I think that's up to us to maybe examine why someone is trying to unseat us and make us feel insecure. People that are making us feel insecure, they have their own objective and it's not in your best interest.
And a recent example of the reporting as advocacy or journalists with an ulterior motive who want to prop up a local news story as some kind of avatar of a national crisis is a story you just covered in late May about Fred Copeland, known fondly as Bubba, a pastor in Phoenix City, Alabama, and the mayor of nearby Smith Station, who committed suicide, and his death soon made national headlines. Can you walk us through the details of this story? It was so well covered, and how commentators on both the right and the left tried turning it into national news?
Sure. So the Fifth Column podcast, which some of your listeners probably know, received an email from a listener of theirs who said, someone that I went to high school with, he was the pastor and the mayor of small towns down here, and he committed suicide 4 days after a newsletter online out of Birmingham, Alabama, called 1819 News, had uncovered sites where Bubba Copeland had cross-dressed and also had chat with strangers, and also wrote some erotic fiction that was very erotic and somewhat violent to a certain extent, and in a sort of reckless way had used the real name and sort of identity of one of his constituents. The woman that wrote in said, I don't understand why they did this. Nobody knows who this publication is. And I don't think that this man's memory should be remembered like this, because what had happened is that several local publications, and of course other places pick it up, had tried to make him a martyr for the LGBTQ community. Look what happens when you out people. They're going to kill themselves. And she's like, they didn't know him. They don't know anything about him. How do they know that he's trans? She's like, how do you know that? He and his wife had a kink or he dressed up. Like, what? Why are you doing this? So she felt angry about that. And I agreed with that. I don't want other people's tragedies to fuel your mission, no matter how much I might agree with the mission, as I put in the piece. So I decided to go down there to talk to a bunch of people who knew him and to talk to the writer of the article and to try to find out a little more about their publication. It turned out that this publication was started in 2021 with money from sort of a political operation that was very conservative, pretty Christian. And they basically, as I had an editor-in-chief of a different publication down there, they said that they just want to play the morality police. And when they found out someone they had never heard of before Monday, October 30th, and I remember that because that's my birthday, by Wednesday morning, they had an article up about him. They'd never heard of him and they had never heard of where he lived. But yet, within less than 24 hours, they had put a story out where they exposed him. They called him on the phone only for corroboration. Is this you? So let me ask you a question, because I talked about this with Katie Herzog, who does the Great Blocked and Reported podcast, because it's a story she and Jesse Singal had looked at very cursorily when the first articles came out, the little Make Him a Martyr. I said, what would you have done if you had gotten this information as a journalist? It's like, he's not a public figure, but he kind of is. He's a pastor and he's a mayor. Like, what would you do with this information? She's like, I don't know. I'd probably talk to a friend who is more experienced than me. I said, I would too, to see whether it was any reason to run this story. But what I definitely would have done was I would have gone and talked to him and tried to get some context here. They didn't do that. They ran 4 stories in 3 days and Bubba Copeland blew his brains out in front of the police. And afterwards, the paper that did it had no regrets whatsoever. They thought it was unfortunate, but they thought that they'd done their job. Their job was to expose this man's behavior because they don't agree with it. They're very Christian. He considers himself a soldier for Christ, the CEO. And I thought, well, this is a story that deserves to be told more fully. So that's what I did. I spoke with friends of Bubba Copeland's and I went to his church and I went to the little store that he owned and I tried to understand where he found himself. I also tried to understand the journalist who wrote the piece. People have to kind of read the piece. It's a little complicated, but I had some sympathy for him, for how he found himself writing this piece and his place in the world as a journalist. But these are the kinds of stories, we're really, really lucky that we get to be able to tell these stories sometimes that let you look underneath the skin and underneath the shouting and not pointing fingers. Though I understand that, 1819 was not too pleased with me for writing this, but that's how it goes. So that's that story.
What I have always liked about your work is that it's actual reporting. Even when you make your own opinion about a story known, sometimes afterward or sometimes within the article itself, you never give short shrift to the opinions of people who might disagree with you. In this instance, the writer for 1819 News. You're able to still empathize with them in the same way that you were able to empathize with protesters during Black Lives Matter protests in 2020 and 2021, even when you very strongly disagreed with what they were doing or their motives for doing so. And there's such a big difference between actual on-the-ground reporting and advocacy, which is what 1819 did with this story. To answer your question, it was not reporting, it was advocacy, because actual reporting is getting the opinions from both sides of an issue. And advocacy is what places like the Los Angeles Times did. They didn't go to small town Alabama. They just held this person up who they'd never met, similar to 1819, as a symbol of their side. It's inherently dehumanizing.
I mean, how would you like it if it was your mother or your brother and all of a sudden this person's just being used as a tennis ball in the culture wars?
Yeah.
Sorry, mixed metaphor. And of course, sometimes I have feelings about stories. I'm not completely just a brick here, but I do believe that I really want people to tell me the story. I'm the one that constructs it, and then the reader can kind of get from it what they do. But of course, I'm in there to a certain extent. I'm not cherry picking, hopefully. But what's so funny? A lot of people have said this. It's like, wow, it's so great that you go out and do reporting. And I guess it's because I learned to be a reporter in the 90s, but that was how you reported. There was no Google. But it's not just that, because of course I Google things. I want to talk to people. Like, one of my favorite things in the world is getting in my car or getting on a plane and getting to a new place and saying, okay, Let's find out what this is about. And I understand there isn't the money in journalism that there used to be. There just aren't the budgets. But to get out and actually talk to people and report is, for me, the best thing in the world. And for people to say to me, wow, it's so great you do that. I'm like, no. This is my joy. Some people still do it. Other people don't. It's lucky for me.
The kind of reporting that you do is increasingly rare. There was a recent report a few months ago on NPR's listenership and its drastic decline since, about a decade ago. There was a whistleblower within NPR who was soon let go after the whistleblowing, which I think only further proved his point. But I used to be literally a daily listener of NPR, probably for about 10 years. I first listened to it on the radio and then streamed it. I had multiple shows of theirs on my podcast player. And yeah, its politics largely aligned with my own. I'm center left. But I think where people within these larger media institutions, what I think they get wrong is they think that people have a problem with the fact that they have a left-ish opinion, right? Like in the same way that you have your own opinion about your stories. But that's not the problem. I have no problem with the fact that NPR has a leftward bent. I never did. The problem that I think most people have is the same problem I would have with 1819 News. It's boring. If all you're going to cite is right-wing opinions in your coverage of a story, opinions that agree with your own ideology, I'm bored. In the same way that if all you're going to do, if you're covering a Antifa versus Proud Boys riot or whatever, and you only spoke to everyone on the Antifa side and don't speak to a single Proud Boy and then put that off as if it's reporting on the event, I'm bored. It's just boring to hear the same opinion over and over again. And I think that's why most people have checked out.
It's unbelievably boring. It's sort of like going to a buffet where there's only 3 items. And listen, so the chef in the kitchen is telling you, this is the stuff you really want to eat. Because if you eat this stuff, you're going to be like healthy and strong and have all the right opinions, right? But it's so boring. Also, like, why would you not? I mean, I've actually done this. I have gone to it was going to be a big throwdown between Antifa and Proud Boys. And I hung out with the Antifa people. I hung out with the people just sort of milling around the Portland waterfront. I marched with the Proud Boys back over the bridge. I talked to everybody. That's a story I want to read. I want to read that story. I don't want to read the story that tells me I'm right all the time. Because guess what? That's boring too, and it's untrue. So it's just so much fun. But yes, NPR, they're just tanking. And Michael Moynihan, a good friend of mine, part of the Fifth Column, used to be with Vice. He just did a big interview with Barry Weiss over on the Honestly, talking about why Vice tanked. And it's because the reason people loved Vice is they were absolutely irreverent, disgusting, hilarious. And all of a sudden, it's like, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to do any of that because we might offend somebody. And we have to be the good people now and only this. Well, what happened? Bye, Vice. You're not going to take any of that to the bank. You have to actually challenge and titillate your audience and not decide that you know what's best for them. That's like schoolmarmish and scoldy. That's not journalism.
We've mentioned Portland a few times already in this conversation. Let's figure out how you ended up there. You were someone who was raised in a city the national news does love to cover. You were born in Manhattan and raised in Brooklyn. You lived in LA for 18 years. And actually, as a Los Angeles resident currently myself, where in LA did you live?
So I started off in West Hollywood and then wound up in Hollywood and Silver Lake and spent the last 5 or 6 years in Los Feliz, right by the Shakespeare Bridge.
Oh my gosh. I was in Los Feliz from 2007 until 2023, and now I live in North Hollywood. So you lived in 2 of the country's biggest cities, the 2 cities where all the news happens. And then in 2004, you moved to Portland with your husband. What drew the 2 of you there? Why Portland and why then?
So my husband was raised there. And he turned to me in 2003 in LA when we were half thinking about buying a house, but the housing prices in LA back then were insane. He said, Portland isn't the horrible, depressing city it was when I grew up in the 70s and 80s when everybody was a junkie and the Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh followers were all downtown. He'd been going up there because his grandmother was dying. And he's like, let's take a look up there. He wanted to leave LA. He didn't like Los Angeles. He'd moved down from San Francisco to live with my daughter and me. So we went up in May, which is when you should take people to Portland because it's Planet of the Plants and it's so, so beautiful. And we bought a house And so we lived there. I was there from 2004 until 2019. And it's interesting that you mentioned, going from New York to Los Angeles, because when we first moved to Portland, I was a bit unmoored by what felt small to me. Yes, there's the great outdoors, but I'm also like a city girl. I'm like, yeah, great. I mean, the outdoors are great. Yeah, but that's not what makes me go. And I remember turning to my husband and snottily saying, okay, so New York, Los Angeles, Portland, what's next? Anchorage? He's like, baby, just chill, okay? So it was a bit of a hard landing in some ways, work-wise for me. I still wrote for the LA publications and for the Nationals pretty steadily until 2008, 2009, when journalism completely took a dump and the editors were fired, the magazines closed. I wrote for the local papers, different pay, different what you can do. And then I think we'll get to it, but I started working on a book in 2009, which occupied me for a long time. But yeah, I've written a lot about Portland.
Yes, you have.
Especially since 2019, especially for Reason Magazine and on my own Substack. And Portland was interesting when I got there because from my perspective, and I'm sure people that live there, I think some of them would agree, it was on the up. It was affordable. It was beautiful. People that had gotten priced out of San Francisco or LA or just wanted something different or had grown up in Idaho and sort of wanted to start a little something bigger than in Pocatello. They came to Portland and they didn't have a lot of money, but they had a lot of drive and everybody brought their ideas. And I got to tell you, Michael, for about 5 or 6 years there, it's pretty dynamic. The restaurant scene was crazy. I started having different national magazines ask me to write about Portland for them because the food scene was so good. And design, music, and some media. You had the show Crim. You had, of course, Portlandia. It was a young city on the move, on the make. And there were a lot of interesting plans. And then...
Yeah, we will get to that. Yeah. It's a big and then. It's a very ominous and then.
Yeah.
As a fellow Angelino, I totally relate to your comment about how it is a bit of a culture shock. Portland, at least when I was visiting back in the 2010s, like it held within it this tension between that kind of ambition of the people who were moving there, and especially the food scene was phenomenal, people opening up small businesses, but also this feeling of, and I think Portlandia said it best, the city where young people go to retire. Like there was this weird mixture of those two things happening simultaneously where I felt both a profound ambition and a profound lack of ambition, depending on who you were talking to. The first time I visited Portland was back in 2011. And personally, I mean, aside from that weird kind of culture shock, I really fell in love with it. I visited several times between 2011 and 2016, though I try to visit the Pacific Northwest at least once a year. My wife and I actually got back from the San Juan Islands exactly a week ago. But there was so much I loved about the culture of the city. I loved Powell's books, Washington Park and the Japanese Garden, A Pizza Shoals, Mount Tabor. It was my first introduction to McMenamins, which I highly recommend to anyone who visits either Oregon or Washington. I watched every episode of Portlandia. I found myself laughing at the truthful observations mixed in with the exaggerated absurdity. And then in May of 2020, in response to the killing of George Floyd, Portland rioted for over 100 consecutive days and nearly 200 days total. And there have been ongoing protests since the election of Donald Trump in 2016, including the social justice mobbing of your husband's coffee shop. But things really hit a tipping point in 2020, where everything seemed to explode. So as someone who lived in Portland, as you mentioned, from 2004 until 2019, what the hell happened to Portland?
Well, I think it started happening around 2014, 2015. Again, it was a young city. Young people go to retire. And I think, and I've written this several times, that Portland sang a really beautiful siren song. And that siren song was, come here and actuate your dreams, your green dreams, your artistic dreams, your affordability dreams. Come here and build the kind of society and city where there are bicycles and where you can get out to the country and where you can afford to open a bike shop or marry someone of the same sex. You can really live your liberal fantasy. A lot of young people came and then they found themselves working at a telemarketing firm in an office park in Beaverton. And it was like, hey, wait a second. Why am I living with 8 people? Why can't I have what the people that got here 6 years ago had, where they can open a restaurant where the rent was $1,000 a month and then wind up in the New York Times? I think there was a sense that they felt a little bit that Portland had betrayed them, had promised something that wasn't actually going to work without them busting their ass in a way that, yeah, sure, maybe they wouldn't have had to do 6 years earlier. But hi, my parents had a $53 a month apartment in the most pretty street in the West Village in 1963. I'd love to have that apartment, but that's not the way the world works. So between that and the fact that Trump was the nominee, where they were told, we're getting back to what we were talking about earlier, Michael, they were told to be afraid, right? He is the worst person. He's going to bring fascism to this country. Almost every single shop window put up the sign, "You are welcome here. You are safe here. Portland is a safe place for you." And they just had this energy of marching and marching. Trump is elected. They're marching down on ICE headquarters. There's a Not My President march. There's a May Day march. The local paper started a marching and protest section because it gave people a lot of energy. As I said, I covered the Proud Boys and Antifa thing in 2019. So this is before George Floyd. This is before COVID. They were already primed. I mean, this pump was being primed. Then you had COVID. You've got thousands upon thousands of young people locked in their houses. They can't go out and drink. They can't go out and fuck. They can't go to the movies. They can't do anything. Oh, and then George Floyd is killed. It begins as peaceful protests. Really, the biggest bridge in the city, they also call Portland Bridge City. Burnside Bridge, 10,000 people march over. Damian Lillard, then of the Portland Trailblazers, is leading. They go into downtown. They wind up in front of Justice Center, which is the police station and the federal building. And then it's a protest and people go home, except for the 200 people that break into the police station, set fire to it, break everything. I wrote an article about a woman that was locked in the basement, and that was the beginning. Now what's happening to these people in Portland? Remember that national news we're talking about? Yes, things that happened in Minneapolis. Minneapolis, which I've also been and seen that police station burned to the ground, but they're not having the nightly riots that Portland is having. So what's happening now? All eyes on Portland. What's that do to people when everybody's staring at you? Oh, I'm doing something good here. I am doing something that the rest of the country is looking toward. Well, that gives you a little bit of gas in your tank, right? So they came out every night. And then what happens? Donald Trump decides to send in some federal troops to protect the federal building, which is directly next door to the police station, which has been attacked now for 2 months. Now they're attacking the federal building. He puts troops in there, and that becomes the absolute locus. I got to tell you, it was a gigantic party, and I'm not using that unadvisedly. It was a party there every night. There was food. There was music. There was shooting makeshift IEDs at the building and shining flashlights. And there was chanting and there was drumming. And some of it was for what they really believed were the right reasons. And a lot of it was just to fuck shit up. Because if you ask them, which I did multiple times, what are the objectives here? Photography equals death. I'm like, wait, great. Okay, fine. Photography equals death. What are you trying to do? They can't answer because there is no next productive thing. It's about burning stuff down, which, hey, it's a thing that people do. Let's burn it down. The problem was it got pretty violent. We had a cold-blooded murder during the protests. Meanwhile, this is what you were saying. What is the national press doing? They're saying, well, they really are angry there in Portland and they're really trying to fight the good fight against Trump. Or they're presenting these people as doing something heroic. Or they're saying they're so upset about racism and George Floyd that this is how they must express themselves. Well, I think a little of that can be true, but as someone who covered this for dozens and dozens of nights with tear gas and the police union being burnt down multiple times and being chased and having my phone stolen and watching people absolutely provoke the police, this was their utter delight to provoke the police into coming at them and then filming themselves so they could always be on the defensive and saying, look what the police are doing to us. Now, did the police act in sterling ways the whole time? Of course they didn't. This is also riot stuff going on every night. There's going to be melees. But Portland's story was one that I feel was profoundly misreported for a long time. I was very, very lucky that I got out there. I didn't go till July, but I was there for many dozens of nights, and Reason Magazine probably ran 20 stories that I wrote, and I wrote one for the New York Times as well. There were people desperately hungry to try to figure out what was actually going on the ground because they could smell that the reporting they were getting from maybe MSNBC wasn't actually what was happening. So that was a story, in a sense, I owned. I'm glad to have owned it. But at the same time, I wish that there had been more people that didn't feel that they had to be advocates for the protesters. I was told way more than once by people, by other journalists, if you're not supporting the protesters, then you're a fascist or you're a Trump-tard. I'm like, no, I'm talking to everybody here. But the story you're reporting as one side is all right and the other side is all wrong is not the story that I saw happening on the ground.
The death of nuance is the death of truth. The Portland riots and a lot of what was happening around 2020 was one of several events as reported by mainstream outlets. And again, similar to NPR, like I think the change for me probably started happening around 2017, 2018, but 2020 just basically accelerated it to the point of extinction. But before then, I was almost exclusively reading the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, BBC. I was listening to almost exclusively NPR. I read almost none of those sources anymore. Occasionally the Atlantic, I think they're doing good work on some issues. But some of the events was like the Covington Catholic story, the Kyle Rittenhouse story, the Portland riots, COVID reporting, like story piling on top of story, piling on top of story, where it created this extremely false and dangerous binary of there is the good guy or good group on one side of the story and the bad guy or the bad group on the other side of the story. And if you don't side 100% with the good guy, the person we've deemed the good guy or the good group, it doesn't matter what nuance there might be or the fact that there might be no good people or bad people, but just people doing things in their own self-interest. If you don't agree with our good group side, you are in the bad group. And it completely destroyed reporting because that's not how the world works. I think that you've rightly said. And the way that you report these things, it's very clear. There are very rarely good and bad people. There are people motivated in their own self-interest, and that leads to certain outcomes. In a 2021 article you wrote for Persuasion titled Destruction and Hope in Portland, to quote it in support of something you just said, as one activist who participated in the burning of the police union hall in Kenton told me, quote, I'm not going to lie, it's fun, end quote. And yet, according to most mainstream outlets at the time, he was a freedom fighter. You also spoke with Noah Kassab, a Palestinian immigrant who opened a jewelry store in downtown Portland in 1990 with her late husband, who watched via security cameras at 1 a.m. on May 30th, 2020, as her store was looted and destroyed while nearby policemen, visible from those same security cameras, stood by. A year later, in June of 2021, Kassab said to you, quote, why is it right now Portland is still, more than a year later, boarded up and closed? Because of our city officials who lack leadership and they should all be fired, totally fired, end quote. And it's a blessing that you interviewed her because it is a dagger in the heart of this narrative where people who supported the riots and protests said they were doing it on behalf of marginalized communities, in behalf of people of color. The same people marching for Palestine today looted and rioted and completely destroyed a Palestinian woman's jewelry store in the name of social justice. And that cognitive dissonance or lack of any cognitive firing at all was disgusting.
One thing I've been glad to do is when I do speak with protesters and you see how very, very young some of them are, it gives you an idea of the people that are causing this damage. They are very young. Young people are idiots. I was an idiot, okay? And they had been in the house for COVID and they're just not making good decisions. In terms of Noah Kassab, what she said was the city deserves to be fired, the officials. And in fact, we're seeing that happen. And let me explain a few things. So at the heat of the protests in Portland, August of 2020, Mayor Ted Wheeler, he got on television and he basically was trying to call out Trump. I mean, Ted Wheeler, who probably weighs 130 pounds soaking wet and is not a particularly dynamic guy. It's like, we're right here in Portland. We're going to show you. You're sending in the feds. Of course, he got tear gas that night. And of course, the next day, Trump is calling him tear gas Ted. But tear gas Ted Wheeler also got a measure of identity. Everybody did that was involved in this. And Portland was going to be, I've written this before, was going to be the little city that got that criminal out of the White House. And I say this as no fan of Donald Trump, believe me, but they almost thought that they were going to do it. Couple that with the fact that Portland got a brand new DA in May of 2020, Mike Schmidt, who declined to prosecute 94% of the protesters, including the people that looted Kassab's store. And I've seen the footage. I think it's linked in the Persuasion article. I mean, there are dozens of people and they're smashing. You can see them. One person was prosecuted. And this is because Mike Schmidt's office, extremely progressive in the sort of Chesa Boudin of San Francisco mold, He just really wanted to remake the criminal justice system. And if you want to remake the criminal justice system, you can't put people in jail. Well, I agree with not putting people in jail for stupid stuff like you're smoking a joint or whatever. It's stupid. Don't do that. However, if you are looting someone's store and destroying property, I understand it's hard. There's a lot of stuff going on, but you can't put up with that. Well, what happened this past May 21st? Mike Schmidt was voted out. Okay, he's gone. The people had had enough between him not deciding to prosecute criminals, Measure 110, which is a whole nother story about the legalization of all street drugs in Portland, and they wanted him out. He's gone. I say we, I don't live in Portland anymore. The pendulum swung too far. I think that they believed, and you still have some true believers there, of course, in every city you do, that they could swing it around, and that utopia, that siren song that was promised by Portland in like 2010 or whenever, they still thought they could make it. And they couldn't. They can't because, in fact, most people don't want the city on fire for 200 nights. Most people are not super cool with the Thai restaurant they go with their family that's 2 blocks from the federal building having its window broken 10 times. They're just not that cool with it. They're afraid that's what's happened to other businesses is going to happen to them. They just want to keep their noses clean. They want to take their kids kayaking on the weekends. But when it gets too far, when there's just too much what they perceive to be lawlessness and a downtown that took 3 years to come back, if it even has, it's too much for them. And they're going to vote out the people that they feel were complicit in going too far.
To your point, kids, young people generally are going to sometimes be idiots. I mean, I was often an idiot at that age. And people at that age, like me at that age, they don't think through the second order effects of their actions. You know, they tear down Chesterton's fence because they find fences oppressive without thinking about what those fences might be containing or preventing. And that's fine. I think it's good for young people to be idealistic and not always think through the long-term consequences of their actions. But for me, I think the last few years aren't a referendum on young people doing what young people have always done, but a referendum on the adults in the room, both in Portland and nationally, for standing down or deferring to those young people.
I couldn't agree with you more. I've written that and I've quoted people, including a gal that just ran. She didn't win her election in Portland. Like, when are the adults in the room going to say, okay, enough? I have to tell you, I don't know if you were in Portland at all in, let's say, 2021 or 2022. It was horrible. It was horrible what happened to downtown. And I have people say to me, oh, Nancy, you're doomsdaying. It wasn't that bad. No, it was bad. It was bad. You lost population. You had whole blocks closed. You had people dying on the street because they could do all the drugs they wanted without any consequence. But I think Portland is pulling out. And I hope so, because it's inevitable that it will rejuvenate. What it's going to become, we don't know yet. But it's inevitable that it will rise, I hope.
I have this feeling that this is part of a larger trend that we're seeing play out in parenting over the last couple decades, where so many parents want to be seen as like a friend of their children, or like they don't want to be the bad guy. And so you get these situations where you'll be out to eat and you'll see a little kid who's 5 or 6 years old running around at TGI Fridays or whatever, throwing a tantrum or like being an absolute nuisance in public. And again, can't blame the kid for doing kid things, but you see the parent, the adult, just tolerating it, deferring to the child. It's not entirely strange to see this play out on a micro level with parenting, even if I think that the parents should probably practice a little more restraint with their kid. But it is terrifying to see that same dynamic play out with elected politicians and youthful activists. It feels like leaders are so worried about being framed as the bad guy, even if that framing is incorrect and untrue, or as the oppressor, that they can't just step up and be like, all right, guys, enough. You're going to get arrested if you continue to do this. You have to follow the law. And it just feels like a weird abdication that is ahistorical. It's never happened until the last 10 or 20 years.
I think Trump just made everybody insane.
Yeah. Broke people's brains.
He did. It broke people's brains. The great provocateur, right? And I think that people saw that if you were going to be tough on crime, let's say, or tough on young people saying they were changing the world, then that you were somehow in Trump's camp and you didn't want to be there. Also, people that were sort of lenient on the kids, let's say, their publications were making money. That is not the case anymore. I mean, look at what is happening at the Washington Post. They lost something like, my friend Matt Welch said they were losing $200,000 a day, whatever, do that times 365. they're just tanking because, again, they have the buffet with just the kasha, the spinach, and the tofu. It's like, no, we don't want that anymore. We're not interested in that. In terms of parenting, yeah, I remember being at the park when my daughter was like 3, and there was another mother there with her 3-year-old, and she's saying, Mikey, do you want to go home? I'm like, why are you asking a 3-year-old if he wants to go home? Like, get him in the car. You can't let the kids make these decisions. And also, they don't want to make the decisions.
Correct.
They want some bumpers. Bumpers give them security. And then you can mess with that security sometimes. If they go to bed at 8 o'clock every night, you could keep them up till midnight on July 4th. That's fine. But giving them that you're not in control, that is not what kids want at all. They want you to not be super strict or anything, but to know what the parameters are here. I have a friend, her pet peeve is that dogs are on the subway now. And she's a dog lover. And it's a small thing, but it is also sort of symptomatic of, okay, so anything sort of goes now, right? From bringing the dog on the subway to surrounding someone at their cafe table and shouting at them that they're pro-genocide or something. Or, what we had during the BLM protest, chasing people out of restaurants because you thought that they were on a side that you weren't on. I don't see this as productive. I don't see shouting at people as productive. I see it as a way to burn off energy. And I know that people get this sort of euphoric, semi-orgasmic feeling from doing this with other people, but I really don't see it as productive. I've said before, they're super great at breaking shit, but they're really bad at building anything. And some people have said to me, well, that's the point, Nancy. They don't want to build anything. They just want to burn everything down. And I'm like, well, okay, but then what are you doing? You're standing there in a bunch of ashes. How is this helping anybody in Portland? That you don't have a restaurant to go to because you've closed them down. I had a friend who is from Israel, but he had a restaurant with a Palestinian, and they basically drove those people out of business.
Yeah, I remember the story, yeah.
Because one person was Israel. I don't know if they drove him out of business, but he finally left. He just sold it to the Palestinian guy because just the fact that he was from Israel was enough. And this was years ago, way before October 7th, that, they were just scrawling terrible anti-Semitic things on his restaurant. Is there any intellectuality here at all? Is there any understanding of history? Or is it just purely, I want to get my yayas out tonight and today it's going to be you?
Yeah. The real point of frustration for me, and I'm saying this as the co-owner of 3 dogs, I am seeing a lot of dogs in grocery stores and I hate it. I hate it. And when I go to employees, I very politely say, hey, I've been coming to this grocery store for many years. I also know that this is not your particular problem. You're just an employee working here, but I have to register this complaint. It is disgusting to see dogs walking around this grocery store and the employees throw up their hands and they're like, yeah, we've heard that a lot, but there's nothing we can do. And I just want to say, yeah, there 100% is something you can do. You can tell the people with the dogs to get out of the store, but it feels like there's this weird universal thing that's going around where it feels oppressive to enforce any kind of rules. And it's making the quality of life for kind of everyone markedly worse.
Well, we know the stories of the shoplifting. I don't know if your toothpaste is locked up. Mine sure is. I've been in the store twice, in the drugstore, where people are stealing things and running out, and the employees just stand there. They've been told not to do anything. And then people that do step in and do something, they've been fired. This would be interesting to really just try to chart the outgrowth of that. Where does that come from? Well, we know there was a racial reckoning in 2020, right? And we know that there was a lot of destruction of property, and then there was some looting, but then people are saying looting is good. And then there's always well, why are you angry at someone that has to steal Pampers? It's always the Pampers, right? They always need the Pampers, but that's not what's happening.
Yeah, every thief is Aladdin.
Why can't you just look at this and say, do you agree with stealing?
Right.
If you agree with stealing, if you think that stealing is a good thing, then you may take that position. But most people don't. And especially small business owners do not. Or getting your window broken. Oh, please, if I had a nickel for every time someone said, oh, they've got insurance. I'm like, do you actually know how insurance works? Because that's not how it works. And at a certain point in Portland, nobody could get their windows insured anymore. Because the companies are like, okay, that's it. We can't do this anymore because we plan on you getting a broken window once every 5 years. You had it 5 times last month. We can't do this. This is not worth it to us.
Right. A literal result of a lack of broken windows policing.
There we go.
As I mentioned earlier, you and Sarah Hepola, who I spoke with on this show last year, you co-host the Smoke 'Em If You Got 'Em podcast. And in a recent guest appearance on the Comedy Cellar podcast, the host mentioned to you how much Smoke 'Em If You Got 'Em resonated with his wife, that the two of you were, quote, getting right into her brain, woman to woman, end quote. And you said something really interesting and I think profound in response. You said, quote, when women start to have more complicated or nuanced conversations about Me Too or feminism, there's a certain line. There's a certain line that you're expected to walk and to hew, and frankly, I don't, end quote. And I would love for you to say more about this.
Sure. I've written about this a lot. First of all, I love Sarah Hepola. We started the podcast 2 years ago, just sort of on a whim, and we're just having a blast doing it. So everybody should tune in over there.
She is great.
Yeah. I just remember 2017 rolled around, Harvey Weinstein. It was just the biggest thing that had happened in so long that women felt that their voices were going to be heard in ways that they hadn't been in terms of sexual assault and sexual abuse. And I can't quantify for you what sort of good has happened from that. I am sure it has. I am sure that a lot of people felt emboldened to speak up. I don't know why they wouldn't have spoken up before, but that's me. Okay. I have a certain personality. I'm not quiet about things. I don't feel a power dynamic where, oh my God, I can't say anything. So I can't speak for how other people would react. But then I noticed people using Me Too or claiming to have been sexually assaulted when it was pretty clear, at least to me and to other people, that they hadn't been. And yet they got a lot of recognition and a lot of sunshine and seemed, this was now an identity. And I thought that was not correct. And then we started seeing things like the Aziz Ansari story. He went out on a date with this woman and she wrote a piece saying, I really wanted white wine and he had ordered red. And I felt that was our first red flag. And then I went back to his apartment and we started having sex, but then I decided I didn't want to. And so I left. And now I want to talk about it and frame him as the bad guy. I was just like, wait, what's happening here? So there should always have been nuance inserted into Me Too, but that was very unpopular. You had to be full stop, pro Me Too. And I thought that was idiotic. I thought that you have to look at everything on a case-by-case basis. I'm happy for strides that are made. I really, really wish, and we hear this talk about, but I don't know that Me Too did anything about getting rape kits processed faster. That's something that I could certainly get behind. And I think a lot of women felt the same way that I did, but they didn't want to say anything because, trust me, at that time, if you did not appear fully in the camp, you were a misogynist or a rape apologist. I mean, I have to tell you, almost every gal that I know that thinks about this stuff with some, let's use the word nuance, or on a case-by-case basis, has been called a rape apologist. It's like, okay, really? Is that one of the 7 phrases that you have that you don't like me or you don't like me having a different opinion from you that you're going to sling at me? But we have now come around. I believe we are no longer I know for a fact we are no longer in 2017. I believe we are at a place where we want to look at what people are doing and saying. I've written 2 posts for my Substack, which is Make More Pie or nancyrommelmann.substack.com, called The Last Me Too. And I've talked about why a recent case involving Yasha Monk was the last Me Too, in a sense that the gal that made accusations against him, I think it was in January, a woman named Celeste Marcus wrote a piece about how she had been sexually assaulted by a friend. It was sort of an elliptical, opaque piece. She didn't name the person. It was a bit hard to understand. I guess it didn't get the traction she wanted, but she wrote an email to Jeffrey Goldberg, editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, saying, you have a rapist on your staff and you should basically do something about it. And Goldberg responded to her in saying, oh my God, I'm so sorry, I'm so alarmed. We're definitely going to look into this. Well, I guess he didn't look into it fast enough because within, I might get my date line wrong, a month, a week, she took his email to her and hers to him and put it on Twitter, basically saying, I expected a different response from this. He didn't do anything. And that rapist is Yasha Monk. Okay, so basically she decided that she had never reported anything to the police. She had not confronted Monk, but she was going to go to the court of Twitter. And that's what she did. And had it been 2017, I'm sure it would have been a different response. But what happened is she did not get the response that I think she anticipated, which would have been, 10,000 people saying, I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry this happened to you. People were like, wait, but what happened? Because you didn't really explain it. You said he's your friend. It was his birthday. You all got drunk. And then he was in bed with you. And he was one of your good friends. But then you woke up and you were having some sort of sexual experience and he left. So you're saying that this is rape. And people kind of had it, Michael. And Yasha Monk did the smartest thing you could possibly do. He just didn't say a word. He just went about his business, kept his head down. He kept doing his podcast and everything's gone on. He was not destroyed. And I think that was probably the right call. I understand that there will be people for sure that experience sexual assault, which no one should experience, that do not go to a court of law to do this. But if you're going to the court of Twitter, then we made our decision in this particular case. And in this particular case, we didn't understand why she did this. And I'm saying that we, because I've talked to a lot of people about this. I went on several different podcasts about it. But she struck me as, in a sense, the last Me Too. We'll have more. But this was the first one I'd seen that included a pretty celebrated name where he came out of it with his skin intact.
As someone who works in the entertainment industry, I could see on the ground a lot of the good that came out of the movement because there was a lot of sexism and sex-based discrimination that was happening that I could personally see or I'd hear about from female friends of mine. So I know that was real. But at the same time, I also know that a ton of people who were pretty well known to be like either abusers or tyrants just completely got off scot-free and were not held to account. While at the same time, a lot of pretty much innocent people or people who did some inappropriate things that were not crimes that were completely crucified. And so like that was kind of the frustrating thing, seeing it on the ground where a lot of the systemic stuff just hid away in the shadows, while a lot of people who were innocent or next to innocent basically had their lives destroyed. But isn't it interesting that this same standard that you mentioned, having to walk this prescribed from above line, having to have a very specific, almost always decidedly very left-wing opinion about social issues related to one's own identity and experience, is applied to all groups that are labeled quote unquote marginalized. I've seen this play out over and over. I actually just earlier this week spoke about this with Chloe Valdery.
Oh, I know Chloe.
Yeah, Chloe's great.
She's great.
I've spoken about this with other guests of the show, Aisha Akambi, Anika Prather, Brittany Talissa King, about how there is seemingly only one way politically to be black. Joe Biden famously told radio host and comedian Charlemagne, quote, "If you have a problem figuring out whether you're for me or Trump, then you ain't black," end quote. And fellow guest of the show, Andrew Sullivan, right? A tireless advocate for gay civil rights and specifically gay marriage since the 1980s, has been cast out of the gay community because he's too conservative. And I've seen the same thing sometimes up close, like in person to people I know. I've seen it happen to Latinos. I've seen it happen to Asians. And it seems like in this weird kind of irony, Nancy, anyone who isn't a straight white male is held to a very particular standard and a very particular viewpoint that if they betray that viewpoint, they're at risk of losing their identity card, so to speak. It's a weird kind of irony that the people who are labeled marginalized are often marginalized by the constrictions of the views they're allowed to have publicly.
I did want to say, talking about people that should have paid because they acted so horribly sexually, the one that really stuck with me was Les Moonves. I don't know if you ever read the article about him. I believe it was in the New Yorker.
Yes.
That was the one I was like, oh, this guy, get rid of him. Take him away. It was really gross. But who gets to tell anybody what they're supposed to be like? Okay, you're black, you're supposed to be like this. Oh, you're Native American, you're supposed to be like this. And I know exactly what you're supposed to be. There's no such thing as a monolithic culture. Like all Latinas are like this. All blacks are like this. All women are like this. It's absolutely absurd. That is a sort of shorthand that people use when they want to put the world into categories. I'll give you a good example. My daughter, her dad was full-blood Native guy. So she's half Native. And I've been hanging around with natives for 35 years, mostly in Oklahoma, mostly Creek. I was so tired of people that I've known in my life, like, oh, so Nancy, yeah, they're super spiritual, right? They're like very spiritual. I was like, yeah, and we eat lasagna and drink beer and watch TV and laugh. Like, why are you constructing something for them that makes it easier for you? She worked on this TV series some of your listeners will have seen called Reservation Dogs, which is wonderful and funny. And for me, in my experience, and for her, she worked on it. It's so much what the native world is really like. And there was a scene, a great little scene where these sort of like holy activists come up and they give the land acknowledgements and all this. And the kids, the main kids in the show are just like, what the fuck is this? Because that's somebody else's idea of what natives are supposed to be like. I asked my daughter about 2 years ago because someone asked me, like, what does Tommy think about land acknowledgements? So I asked her, I was like, Tommy, what do you think? She's like, what are they? She didn't know what they were. And when I told her, she's like, well, but who are they helping? I'm like, exactly.
Yeah. A lot of this stuff is actually not for the communities they're ostensibly for. It's for the people doing the land acknowledgements to feel good about themselves.
Absolutely. I think that was a lot of what Portland was doing too.
Oh my God, yeah.
We're the good people and we're going to show the world and we're getting some TV time for being the good people. Why would they stop?
Yes. A lot of times when I hear, and this is obviously true of anyone who has not been exposed, regardless of their background, who has not been exposed to other people who are unlike themselves. But in this specific instance, a lot of what I saw during the George Floyd protests, a lot of what I see with these land acknowledgements is specifically in this instance, white people who have never really met or have gotten close to people from these communities they are protesting on behalf of and don't understand them, and oftentimes have an extremely reductive, often deeply racist view of what these people are. And they hold them up as like totems or avatars for their own causes when they really don't actually care about those people at all. Because study after study, poll after poll, has shown that the average Black American, especially those living within communities that are higher in crime, want the same or more police. And they are pro-police enforcement, just not pro-unjust police enforcement. And so it's disgusting for me, not to go on a little bit of a rant here, but it is truly disgusting to me when white people who have clearly never met Black people from the environments they say that they're advocating for are speaking on their behalf as if they're doing them a favor. I haven't encountered that kind of racism from right-wing people, but it's like racism masquerading as justice. Anyway, I could go on about that for quite a while, but it truly does disturb me.
Yeah, I call that the gloss of good intentions. It washes off pretty easy.
And gloss is good for lip service. To wrap this out, Nancy, you publish frequently on Substack, as you've mentioned. It's great, nancyrommelmann.substack.com. A combination of on-the-ground investigative journalism, cultural commentary, and personal essays. Most recently, I must say, a beautiful tribute to the complicated life of your ailing mother. Substack has been a boon, I think we could say, to heterodox, quote-unquote, writers who were effectively chased out of their mainstream media organizations over the last several years, like Matt Iglesias, Andrew Sullivan. The Fifth Column podcast is doing gangbusters on there. Even an entire news organization like Barry Weiss's The Free Press has its home on Substack.
Where I also write for sometimes.
Yes, excellent articles there too. But is this sort of piecemeal $10 a month for this writer, $8 a month for that writer, $9 a month for this other writer? Is it sustainable long term? I'm in the industry, as is my wife, and I've been reading these articles about streaming services, Netflix, Hulu, Apple TV, and how in the beginning of it all, 10 years ago, it was this amazing deal for consumers and these streamers were providing almost limitless content. But now in 2024, there's headline after headline about how these streamers are now consolidating into monthly bundles that are more affordable for consumers and more sustainable for the streamers, many of whom have been bleeding money for years with no profit in sight. And I think similarly, for all of its recent flaws, it's become clear that there is a place, a very real need for institutional journalism that can just do things operating at scale that any one individual writer can't. So as someone who's writing on Substack, both on your own Substack and at the Free Press, is the Substack model sustainable at large long term? And what are the pros and cons of Substack in your view? And what are the pros and cons of old school institutional media?
I think that Substack has been absolutely fabulous. I love the guys that started it. They're wonderful. They're always coming up with new things. The writer gets to do what he or she wants. You can grow it as much as you want. It's really fun. And if you can combine that with doing writing for other places, you can actually make a living. You can make a living podcasting, which I almost do with Sarah Hepola. And you can grow as big as you want. You can be a Barry Weiss, who has been able to really, really parlay a pretty bad situation that she came through. And I love Barry. She's a dear friend into something that is really the hugest publication, let's say, online right now, that is, Substack based, that's independently based. Now, larger institutions. The problem is because we can't fund them, because they can't fund themselves the way they used to, they die. Okay, so we have consolidation. So you have how many great publications, Michael, can you and I name right now? We can name Wall Street Journal, New York Times, The Atlantic. It's really a handful at this point. Anything institutional is going to require or think that it needs some sort of, not verisimilitude in reporting. They will have different voices. And I have to say, I think the Times is doing a better job than they were in 2020. But it's going to be beholden to certain things that Substackers don't have to be. We can follow our own stars. Now, are we going to make $1 billion? Is it sustainable? I don't know the answer to that, but I think what's going to happen is that we will create the next things. We have the opportunities now to create the next things. I guess we always did. Substack makes it easier for us. I don't like the idea of just being aggregated with a lot of other people that sort of write like me. Back in 2021, Matt Welch of Fifth Column and Reason Magazine, he and I started a little site called Paloma Media. It's not online anymore, but we had a blast with it for about a year. And one of the things we'd wanted to do was to get a lot of the voices that we knew, people being kicked out of where they'd been, Andrew Sullivan, who Matt knows, and Barry Weiss, and Katie Herzog. We actually offered Katie Herzog a job when she had left The Stranger. We wanted to get all of these voices under one umbrella, and maybe the readers paid $50 a month, and then you got everybody's Substack. We didn't wind up figuring out how to crack that nut. But in hindsight, do I want to be under an umbrella with sort of my crew? I don't know. I think I want to drink with them. I don't want to do cool shit with them. But I don't think I want us all under the same umbrella. I think we want to have like really weird, different people there. Again, like a bigger buffet. Nothing is sustainable in the long term. Nothing. But what we can always do, and what I even have been doing today, is you can create new things. And maybe if you're lucky and you figure out a way to give it to people that they can read it, like the essay about my mom, which has gotten a beautiful response, you can make a go of it and put some good work into the world, because that's really what I think we're here for, right? Try to put some good work into the world.
I think your instincts were correct because, if you create a tribe for the tribalists, and we've seen this happen multiple times over the last 7 or 8 years, pretty soon you find yourself becoming a tribe with all that entails. Your instincts were on point.
Yeah, there are some publications where I'm not going to name what they are, but I've seen them go so sour in the past couple of months. I'm just like, oh no, like you had a chance, but now you're just chasing that next, we're going to be more of what we are. And it's like, no, be less of what you are. Do something else.
Nancy, I have been a fan of your writing since, I think, 2019, first at Reason Magazine, now at your Substack and elsewhere. And I've said it before, but I'll say it again. You do real, true, balanced reporting, something that is too rare these days. And I am admittedly biased as a paying subscriber to the podcast, but I so look forward to having you back on the show in a couple of weeks with your Smoke 'em If You Got 'em co-host, Sarah Hepola. But until then, thank you so much for your work. And today, thank you for your time.
Thank you so much. I have one more thing to say. If people want to, I wrote a pretty good book in 2018. It's called To the Bridge, A True Story of Motherhood and Murder.
A horrifying one.
You want to talk about investigating and talking to everybody that's part of a story of a woman that killed her children. I think it's a good read. Michael, thank you so much. And I'm going to be seeing you soon with my better half.
I look forward to it.